Hello everyone and welcome to this second session at the Battle of Ideas Festival. This is our second session in the Strand in Conversation with Distance. My name is Ella Whelan. I am the co-convener of the Battle of Ideas Festival for this year along with Alistair Donald. And really, genuinely, more so than any other session, excited about this one. From the picket line to the polling booth, what does class mean today? The issue of class is something that I think that people on all sides of the political spectrum I'm really nervous about talking about, and that's not because it's a kind of a necessarily just a taboo, but because things have really changed around conversations about class. And I think class, working class, are words and terms that mean very specific things at specific moments and have kind of been generalized out of almost all recognition now, where, and we're going to talk about this, is kind of you signify something when you say middle class or working class. It doesn't have that sort of, doesn't feel like it has those in-depth meanings anymore. It sometimes just gets used as being on the right or the wrong side, or being good or bad. And so what we want to try and do in this very limited time, we only have an hour, is to try and dig down into, or perhaps start the conversation about, what does class mean today? Is it recognisably different from what it was 30 or 40 years ago? And why has it changed if it has changed? I don't know what I think about this, but hopefully with the help of my panel, I'm going to be elucidated a bit better at the end of this hour. First of all, I'd like to introduce Brian Denny, who is the Election Coalition Nominating Officer with No to EU, the Eurosceptic organisation, writer and commentator, editor of the RMT magazine, the Journal of the RMT, and author of this beautiful new book on a history of the great 1919 railway strike, which he does have copies of, so please come find him and get some of them afterwards. So that's Brian. And then we have Steve Roberts, who is a company director, former surface worker in the coal industry, and a writer and a commentator. You might have seen him popping up on Sky News with some very impassioned speeches about in relation to Brexit, but also writing about the issue of class for Spiked and elsewhere. Two people who have a history of political activism in relation to class politics, but also two people who are directly active today in relation to talking about class in relation to Brexit, in relation to the workplace, people who have genuine lived experience, but also some very serious political convictions about this idea and this concept. And what I want to try and do is, without embarrassing them, get them to give a little bit of their sort of own perspective, their own history, linked in with trying to use that as a way to illuminate this discussion politically. So with that in mind, let's start. And what I there's a million ways I could jump off with this issue, but I want to first start off, maybe with you, Brian, is what does class mean today? And do you think it has been bastardized, really, in terms of being kind of a tool that someone uses to signify something about themselves? So cards on the table, I've been guilty of doing it. When you get in a tight spot with a political discussion, you say, well, as a working class person, I have this, and then it kind of, it signifies that you're something. But has that lost the political edge that it or the political meaning that it had in the past?
I think we're all victims of our situation at the moment. I've just written this book about a strike 100 years ago. What was really striking when I was doing the research is how things have stayed the same for workers, and they're demonised as problems. And I think that's still the same. But the difference is that working people, well, you have to define what working class is. If you go to work, if you have to get up in the morning and earn a living, and if you don't get a living for 3 months, then you no longer have anywhere to live. You are by definition working class. It's the only way you can define working class. Somebody who works, has to work, and that's more or less everyone I know. Although if I know some people who work in sort of education who are on £29,000 a year, they think they're middle class. It was extraordinary to me, and it becomes a cultural thing where they adopt something that's given to them, and it's like an agonymy that's been given. And I think you can't. working class, the class question is not as the same as it was 30 years ago or 40 years ago. It can't be. It's always different because the situation is much, much different. It's like defining class question for the 20th century, for 19th century people. It just doesn't work. And it doesn't work for the 20th century, for the 21st century. But to say class no longer exists is obviously demonstrably not true. Because people are now on 0 hours contracts, the same they were 100 years ago. You know, working class people are much more vulnerable in free movement and one thing and another. The pressure on wages is larger than it was. It's whether working people are as organised as they were. And it's obviously clearly not. But there are times in history when working class people have more power, have organisations in which to have agency. And at the moment, that's obviously weaker than it was. And I think that's the only thing that defines you. But for people on low wages to adopt middle-class aspirations is not a new thing. If you read the Ragged Trouser of Philanthropists from 100 years ago, there are people who believe they're Tories or believe they're kind of not of the working class. And they don't accept political representation in that way. That's exactly the same as it was 100 years ago or maybe 200 years ago. It's a question of where we are in this moment and whether we have agency or not.
Steve, same question to you.
I suppose me and Brian will tend to agree on an awful lot, and there might be differences, so apologies if I tend to say it just in a different form, like Brian said. I suppose it would have helped everybody if we'd have turned up with a flat cap on and had it under his arm.
Flying
and his St George's flag in one hand and singing God Save the Queen, but unfortunately that's not been working classes about. And we're not just talking about the working class, I think. I'm going to refer to something that people call the establishment, the political class, the media class. I'm going to call them what we've always called them, because this is what they are. They are the ruling class. So no apologies, but that's how I'll refer to what you will term the establishment. I mean, in terms of class, does it exist today? Well, if you wanted confirmation of it, just look at the ruling class's reaction to our magnificent result against all odds in the referendum. The bile, the vitriol, the hatred that the ruling class have shown towards working class people specifically, but also most citizens of this country. If you wanted it, does class exist? That really says it all. And to back up what Brian says, of course, class is exactly the same today for the reason that Brian outlined. As an adult, you have 50 years to earn a living. I don't care whether you're a good teacher earning 50 grand a year or you're a lad labouring on £10 an hour. You have 50 years to work for a living, to put a roof over your head, feed your family, have a decent life. We're not talking about dark satanic mills, but that is where we still are. And that's really what Brian said. But it's also completely different today as well at the same time. It's completely different because of sociologically how the working class has changed, how the ruling class has changed. The organisations of the working class, if there is any at all, worthy of being called that, have changed. And particularly more important, the organisations of the ruling class have completely changed, certainly to the way that I felt it in the miners' strike. They still rule, but in a different way.
Well, that's what I want to press, because we are going to come on to Brexit. I think that's very central to this discussion towards the end of my questions. But focusing on this issue of, okay, so class exists in terms of, you know, what are they, the kind of classifications that people use today, the C1s and C2s and all of that kind of stuff, as in the economic reality of people's lived experience, for many people hasn't changed in the last 40 years in terms of there hasn't been enough mass growth or mass redistribution of resources to change that class dynamic. But has the political sense of working class kind of a cohesive identification with themselves, has that changed? Because if you brought up the miners' strike, and I mean there was a genuine sense at that time, in a very different era, that there was a conscious and active working class. Seems to me that that isn't the case today.
It's really difficult when we're talking about class because it always has been, and probably until we have a classless society will be the biggest category to talk about, and we can go off on all sorts of tangents here. I think what you're raising is the question of, do we have class consciousness? I'd say have we ever had it? I went through the miners' strike, and if people are interested, we'll talk about it at length. But I would have to say We had fantastic solidarity, but I can honestly also say we didn't ever have any really serious class consciousness. And that's the problem on the working class side of things. We have never really had serious political, clarified working class consciousness. It might seem strange coming from where I come from. I don't think it's ever really existed at the level that it should exist. It can exist. It depends on the political fight, and that fight has always existed, and I think it continues today.
What do you mean by that? That it never had any kind of formal
I don't
representation in the form of a...
Look, the working class has always had formal representation in the trade unions and in the Labour Party. The working class has always fought. The working class has fought like hell for everything it's got. It's been given very little. So there's no problem with the working class fighting. Not so much today, we can talk about that, but it's always fought for generation after generation. The question is, where has been the political leadership, the serious political leadership of the working class? And yes, we're talking about the trade union movement, the bureaucracy of the trade union, the disgusting Labour Party. It's an absolutely disgraceful organisation. That's the problem for the working class, is its political wing.
Well, I was lucky enough to be in the session beforehand where there's a comedian talking about being woke, you know. It was a very funny session, but I feel quite woke about the working class in a sense, if you know what I mean. I'm quite sensitive about it in a sense of the working class probably are the most demonised people in this country, if not on earth. I mean, they are seen as, by elites, by cultural elites particularly, as the scum of the earth. And woke people can still call them scum. They can call them gammons, they can call them chavs. They would never go into our safe spaces, which is JD Wetherspoons. They would never go in there because they couldn't go in there and call out the gammons and the scum that are at the bar. And you know, in that sense, you know, I go into a Wetherspoon and I feel social solidarity. I just do. I mean, you know, it's unspoken, but it's there. You know,
but is that all that's there? Because I mean, you worked for a long time and very closely with people like Bob Crow, informal organisations still do, in which there was not just a kind of a sense of social solidarity, but a genuine attempt to form a political solidarity within the movement. I mean, has that changed?
Well, no, quite. I mean, that's exactly right. But there's no difference in that sense. I work for the RMT. It's a class struggle union. We are a class struggle union. We're a political movement in that sense. And I edit the magazine. And we have trouble getting all the picket lines in the magazine because we're on strike all the time somewhere, or struggling for, you know, for a certain grade to get more money. And these people are not Titanic heroes. They're standing at the bar of Wetherspoons when they're not at work. And so these are normal people who have agency through their trade union. So we are lucky, and we are very proud of the fact that we are a class struggle union, thanks in large part to the Bob Crow before we lost him. And we still have that ethos, and people want to be a member of a union like the RMT. Unfortunately, only transport workers can. But the point is that they have agency, and you know, working people still aspire to better themselves or be represented by someone. That's why they take part politically in society, and that's why 70% of C2s, as you put it, voted for Brexit, because they wanted agency. And that's why they're despised, because they've got agency all of a sudden. And that's why Brexit is so important, because all of a sudden they have a voice they never had through the traditional political parties who divvied up. And before 2016, if you was a Eurosceptic, you was a crank. You was obviously a gammon and a C2 and just an awful person. But that's kind of, that's ripped that open. There's this portal has opened where people are now talking about what sort of country do you want to be in, and that's why Brexit is so important, because they all of a sudden have agency. The flip side of that is the cultural elites openly have disdain for them because of that. Peterloo 200 years ago, 60,000 people marched in Manchester for the right to vote. They couldn't read and write, and the yeomanry cut them down, and so many of them killed, right? So Mike Leigh makes a film about Peterloo, and my friend Chris, he went to the premiere, and there he was. Mike Leigh, Paul Mason, that well-known cultural commentator, there was a question time, and someone said, what about Brexit and Peterloo? What are the parallels? And of course, you know, Paul Mason being a Remainer, you know, disparaging about him, but then he asked Mike Lee the question. And Mike Lee said, you have to understand the levels of ignorance in the Northwest. He said that at the premiere of the film. You know, as long as working people are victims, and they can be talked about like as victims, they don't mind them. When they have agency, they're dangerous and they need to be sorted out. That's the point I want to make.
I just want to try and pin this down, because when I speak like I do and quite clearly, people might tend to say that I'm putting the working class down. But I must stress, look, the working class itself has always fought. The problem for the working class, the lack of class consciousness, the political leadership, is the organisations of the working class. They are the problems. They've always been the problems. If you want two examples, you've got one today, Brexit. And I will keep using this word, this disgusting Labour Party that has completely and utterly betrayed the working class on the most important political issue for generations. We had it in the 84-85 strike, where the Trade Union Congress, which was, if you like, the main organisation of all the unions in the country, completely betrayed our struggle against the ruling class. And I've just seen the chap, and I'm sure he won't mind me quoting him, Andrew's in the audience here. And he was being questioned about what I mentioned earlier on, is why, after all this militancy, all this genuine struggle, men and women of the working class, why have we never even approached a transformative society in this country of ours? And he answered it in 3 words: the Labour Party.
Well, I want to talk about the Labour Party, because part of the issue today seems to me is that, it's actually very interesting. It's very rare that you ever hear Jeremy Corbyn or anyone from the others in the Labour Party use the term working class or even class. They say things like the disadvantaged or the workers, which, you know, which is again different. And what I want to try and pin down, though it's difficult, or explore, is because before Brexit, we are going to come on to Brexit. I am going to ask a question about Brexit, but before that, it seemed to me that we've had a long, protracted period of, call it apathy, call it disillusionment, call it stagnation in relation to class politics, in which the main kind of discussions you were having were someone opening up a position for a working class officer at universities, which exist now. People having very impassioned discussions on the Today programme about the need for quotas of working class or disadvantaged, is the word there was, of students at Oxbridge. And so it was this, which seems to be in line with kind of Labour Party politics at the moment, positioning, use the word agency, positioning of the working class and class politics as this thing that just happens to people rather than a vehicle through which politics is changing. I mean, so do you think, putting aside Brexit, because I think that's been the kind of catalyst moment, before then you did have this issue of class almost roaming into identity politics territory?
Well, yes, you've just taken the words out, because that's really what you're discussing here, is that people are saying that class is just another identity. I mean, seriously, those people saying they are completely deluded. The whole point of class politics is to destroy class, to destroy division, to destroy all divisive situations in society, to get to a situation where we have the material means for all of us to completely flourish within a classless society, where the separation that we have, where we can actually develop our individuality, but without the division. And it's a completely ridiculous situation. That's what class politics is about, is to get rid of class, all class. So to actually say that that's just an identity.
Brian?
Well, I think that's what the woke movement is about, isn't it? It's about atomising us all into race, into sexuality, into something else, disabled. We're not all the same. We're all different. We're atomised, and we become individuals. And the more atomised, and this is a culture that is imposed on us by, corporate power. Karl Marx said once that the dominant ideas in society are the ideas of the ruling class. And the ruling class are obviously getting us ready for the idea of atomisation, that any sort of collective activity in the Ayn Rand sense. You know, three people in a round in a bar is communism. You know what I mean? It's something to be stopped. And any sort of social solidarity needs to be broken down. And wokeness is a way of splitting us up, so we don't speak to people that are different from us. Whereas the working class, experience. I mean, I lived in Stepney for years, and middle class people did not drink with Bengalis. I can tell you, they were very separate. They had their own very white, very separate lives. Even though they lived in that area, they lived in gated communities in Stepney. They never went to the Wetherspoons and drunk with a Punjabi fella, which is what most working class people do. They lived cheek by jowl with other working class people, and so they don't have that experience, and they don't identify at all. And the idea of wokeness and separateness is a direct attack on class consciousness and the idea that we have a collective identity and a collective need.
And now, before we go out to the audience, I want to, even though you guys have both raised it, bring in the question of Brexit, but I want to put it to you this way. You're both supporters of Brexit, and I myself am as well. The difficult thing that I think we have to grapple with, those of us, and leave and remain, but understanding this moment, is that Brexit has opened up class divisions, it seems, or opened up the question of whether or not they have returned, because, as you said, Steve, there's been this really quite vicious dividing line and a kind of an us and them narrative very clearly, with, cartoonists putting up pictures of Brexiteers in kind of Burberry outfits, slobbering, and real genuine re-emergence of some quite severe class prejudice, whether it be Essex Man with Shami Chakrabarti and all these kind of things. But, and this is the thing I want to ask you, the thing that seems to be missing in this equation, and where you can't quite say that class has returned as a kind of distinguishing factor in politics, is that the oppressed, if you want to put it, the ones who are suffering the prejudice, the working class we talked about, it's since the referendum result, are sort of nowhere to be seen. Or perhaps I'm putting that too strongly. So can you really say that this has become a class issue when Brexiteers as a class or a section of society don't seem to be managing to come together in that solidarity?
Well, because they haven't got a political voice that they used to have. I mean, the Labour Party do treat the working class as an embarrassing relative that they don't really want to go and visit that much. And I think working class people feel that. After the referendum, there was an election. 83% of voters backed a Labour Party and a Tory party that said they would respect Brexit. So Brexit wasn't even an issue in the election in that sense. People just assumed they were going to vote for a parliament and they were going to implement it. And I think the working class have been watching this on the screens in Wetherspoons with the thing going along. They can see what's going on. They're not stupid, but Parliament believes they are stupid, and we are at a very dangerous juncture where the contempt with this Remain Parliament is held in. I live in Essex, and I can tell you that people. When they say, "What are you going to vote?" You don't understand. I'm never voting again. I'm never voting again. And that's a real feeling. I mean, the anger is palpable. And they haven't got anyone to formally represent them. And I think that's why the Tory party have come in as the new Workers' Party, because they've seen that vacuum and that gap. And it's been done before. 200 years ago, the Corn Laws came in. The Tory party were the party of the landed aristocracy and the farmers. And the Corn Laws artificially kept the price of corn up. Yet it was a Tory party that abolished the Corn Laws. Robert Peel came in and abolished it. Said, if we don't do this, we won't maintain the hegemony that we need. And I think that explains why the Tory party are actually trying to give voice to this working class anger. That the Labour Party and the Green Party absolutely refuse to do so. And they despise them. And it's obvious that they despise them. And where that ends up, Ella, is a very, very dangerous place.
Steve?
Yeah. I mean, class and Brexit, although there's some sociologists that's saying that, yes, the working class voted for Brexit, but also did stockbrokers that's retired in Surrey and what have you. And yeah, OK, we get that. But it's undeniable that the working class, for the first time in a very long time, imposed itself on society. There's no question of that whatsoever. And that shows really here that what's happening is that, yes, the working class sort of rejected the status quo. They voted for change. Again, I think there's still a lack of class consciousness, but there's certainly a class consciousness in our opponents. The ruling class have made it quite clear, nationally, our indigenous class and the supranational class in the EU, that they hate the nation state and us, not just the working class, but all citizens in this nation state. They want to destroy the nation state to have a supranational state. They are attacking the working class, undoubtedly. So they are at this time becoming sort of homogenised as a class against us. And that is another big question. How do we react to that as opposed to just voting leave? It's a very big question, and I'm not sure we can cover it here.
Yeah. Let's give it a shot. Let's take it out to you guys. So let's get the microphones.
Thank you for this session, and thank you for letting me speak. My name is Lisa Mackenzie. I will start with, I am a working class academic. And how much that buys into sort of class politics as identity politics, we'll talk about that later, because I don't think when you're a working class person in a middle class space, the fact that you're working class is a political act in itself, which is that's why I do it. So really this is just about, there's two things here about the definition of class. And we were talking about how definitions, you know, have they changed, have they not changed? Well, my definition as a sociologist is that class is about power relationships between groups and between classes. So therefore, without a middle class, you don't have a working class, because it's that power relationship between, where one group of people are unfairly advantaged over another group of people who are unfairly disadvantaged. So for me, it's about power and access to institutional resources. And that changes in context, but never changes in lived reality.
So I'm just wondering about the term working class, and how does that relate to new precarious workforces who don't maybe have to do with mining or transport or working in factories, but who are yet working on 0 hours contract, maybe in tech service industries and things like that?
I wanted to just bring up the Battle of Canning Town, which seemed to be with the Extinction Rebellion and people, you know, climbing up onto the tube and commuters dragging them down. I thought that was kind of a little, you know, maybe miniature Brexit in a way, an expression of class consciousness against, you know, these actually very posh, double-barreled named, you know, climate activists. I wondered what do you make of that kind of movement? Because that movement to me seems very explicitly anti-working class. You know, the contempt for, you know, ordinary people's living standards is just dripping from every utterance of these people. I mean, I don't know if you wanted to talk about that a bit.
I just wanted to raise the divisions or the attitudes really within the broader Labour movement. Historically, I think there's always been the Labour Party has sort of represented the Labour aristocracy, the more sort of secure and often the technical end of the working class, a skilled end, and there has always been, I think, historically, a sort of disdain for the bottom end, that they're possibly the people who, the working class who vote Tory, or the working class who aren't really to be trusted. So I think that kind of divide has been a historically part of how the Labour movement has organised. It has been equally disdainful towards what it would regard as the sort of the Tory working class, or the working class residuum, or and the bottom end. That's one thing. I think it's always been there. This question I have, however, is if we don't organise, or people don't organise through the Labour movement, what is there? What mechanism is there for people to actually to organise and find their consciousness and express it?
Hello, I'm really interested in what you've been saying, having been involved in the trade union movement for many years, retired now. Two things, really. I think with the working class now, we don't call it the working class, we call it the underclass, or the left behind, or, as you say, the disadvantaged. And I really understand what you're saying about identity politics. We don't talk about working class or anything. We have divided it, subdivided it, and it's very negative instead of looking at what we've got in common and the fight that we should have together. So, this leads me, and I agree with what you're saying about the Labour Party, let us down, over so many periods. So, where do we go now? Do we go to the Brexit Party, who are the ones that are fighting for this one very important cause? And I'd like your thoughts on that.
Okay.
I thought it was be worth thinking, working class is a lot bigger than it was. It was about 21 million in 1980, it's about 32 million now. It embraces many, many more people. It's a lot more feminine than it was. When I'm listening to Brian, I recognise what you're talking about, but I know that most people in work don't think the way that you do. They don't identify the way you do. It's not a traditional working class. RMT is quite exceptional out of trade unions, many of which, especially white collar ones, are really much more to do with human resource management than they are to do with solidarity. So I think that if we're talking about working class solidarity, it's got to be a thing that's going to be reinvented and remade, rather than something that's just there at hand to revive.
Okay, yeah, let's come back to start with you then, Brian.
It's a theme emerging here about the Labour Party and the Tory Party. The Labour Party is not a socialist party. It's never been a socialist party, and that's quite important. But the Labour movement, the trade union movement, have always remained. They represent working people with different varying levels of success. But the one interesting thing about the RMT is it's not a socialist organisation either. One of the biggest activist base I've noticed in various areas, they're UKIP, they're shop stewards, they're UKIP, they're Tories. And I do the magazine, and they write to me and they say, well, why hasn't Nigel Farage got a thing? Because he doesn't like the EU. And I always say, well, why don't you ask Nigel Farage what he thinks about the EU rail directives, which privatise the railways, because he supports them. I didn't know that. But we are united in representing people at work. We don't exclude people who don't see themselves as, Trotskyists or whatever. We don't really see the world like that. They're just working people that need representation. And that's an important point. On Extinction Rebellion, I think that it's an anti-democratic movement. By definition, all democratic movements want to improve the lives of the majority of people, and the majority of people are working class. So it's an anti-working class movement because they're not really interested in that. I think Piers Corbyn even said that it's about releasing the pension trillions for the corporations to plunder. But there is a culture war going on, and I think we need to talk about that.
Steve, anything?
Yeah.
Especially the one I was interested in is where's to go now?
Yes, well, that's the whole point. I think there were three contributions that really all tied down to where do we go from here. And I don't want to paint the picture that... look, I went through a strike in 84, 85. I might get a chance to tell you about it. And I came through it. I got really lucky. I had 2 pieces of granite that I got through. It was a serious defeat. We gave everything and we lost. But I had 2 pieces of granite. One's my wife of 43 years. She's here today. And the other one is I found the politics and I found political answers. So, you see, I'm not negative about the situation today. I'm really, really positive. I think we've almost been freed up now for the first time in my lifetime, and it ties to the 3 contributions. The last chap that spoke talked about we have to remake a solidarity. We have to remake a class consciousness, if we've ever had one anyway. We have to relate to the working class, to be more universal, not just the working class, but all citizens.
But how can we do
point.
that without rehashing history?
Well, that's the point. The old is dead, it wants burying. It's been, well, look, we've lost. We were betrayed, we lost, the old ways have failed. And we need to find new ways, that's the truth. But I'm extremely optimistic. And the chap talked about what happened on the tube at Canning Town. I think that's fantastic. That's people that doesn't need organising. They don't need a structure. They don't need telling by a bureaucrat or saying, can we go through the chair? I want to raise a pot. They just said, to hell with this, get the buggers off the bloody tube and let's deal with them. And I think that's wonderful. And somebody else says, where do we go now? What is the no? How do we make it? Well, that's the point. We've actually been freed, if you like. The chains have been taken off us. The old's been tried, it's been tested, It's failed, but the working class is still here. Citizens of the nation are still here. And what we can say is that the old has been, let's just face it, the old is useless, it's gone, and we have to remake it. But we're all here. It's just a case of finding the political content that we can universally agree with, and let's have the fight about it in society.
Lovely. Let's bring the microphones down.
It does come to this question, really, whether a new solidarity, a new kind of political consciousness, whether or not it comes through class. And I put that, as a properly open question, because I don't know that it necessarily does so. And I say that even while acknowledging that both nationally and especially internationally, there are more people in the world today that would be categorised as the industrial proletariat than ever before. But I don't think it necessarily follows that class is the prism through which a new politics would arise. It may be, it may be not. I think the question really hinges on the two versions of class consciousness that I think both speakers are using. You see, I think for Brian, you were talking about class consciousness as a sense of solidarity and a sense of agency. But Steve saying there never really was class consciousness. To me, I think he's saying there never really was a sense among working class people of them being the subjects of history and acting in the interests of all humanity by challenging the rule of the bourgeoisie. Well, is it in the interests of all humanity now for us to see things through the prism of class? I think that really is a question that needs answering.
Thank you. And this is, for me, as a middle-class Tory, this is really fascinating stuff, because what you started off by doing was telling me that I'm working class. And never in my entire life have I considered myself to be that. So, I do think it's really important that we have this dialogue, and I think it's also important that we have this dialogue outside the narrow prism of party politics.
Absolutely.
Because I don't think that ever helps, because it won't end. And I do actually think the gentleman before asked a really important question, which I was going to ask as well, but he did it better.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks. So I wanted to try and follow on actually from what was just said there. I think what we've seen over the past 30 years is that the working class, limited as it was, the politics of the Labour Party and the working class that we've had in Britain in the 20th century and into the 21st, it was defeated politically in the 70s and 80s. Everybody thinks the working class was defeated under Thatcherism with the miners' strike and everything else, but it was the Labour Party that softened up the working class in the 70s for those defeats. And for the past 30 years, to a large degree, or a bit less, since the miners' strike and all those big defeats, the working class has been silent as a political actor. And people are quite right to say that something has changed since the Brexit vote. And I think what the Brexit vote shows you, first of all, you may be defeated, but the working class was never going to go away. Right. But what's happened in the last few years shows you that fundamental antagonisms and conflicts that arise naturally in the society that we have cannot be suppressed. And what we've had for 30 years is a form of governance, not democracy, a form of governance which is based on taking conflict out of the natural democratic political arena and handing that to others, where the big questions are resolved somewhere else. And the public and the working class is not engaged in this discussion. So I actually agree that prior to any kind of reassertion of a kind of working class political consciousness, there's something else that needs to be done in the first place, and that is the re-establishment of a democratic political culture in which the important conflicts and questions are put to the public, put to the people, and debated. That is the prior task, actually, to restore a democratic political culture in which interest can re-emerge with proper political representation.
Thanks ever so much for having this discussion, and I totally agree. Definition of working class is if you have to work for your living, or you would like to work for your living, or you're now living on deferred wages, you are working class, and that is the vast bulk of people in this country. And that cuts through so much rubbish and so much crap. Someone might think they're middle class, they might think they're Napoleon, it doesn't mean they are. And they get trapped in that. So there's plenty of people in the working class who voted Remain and don't understand that. The key question is, how do we now organise? Why have we not seized control in the past? And how do we now do it? And I totally, I totally agree that a necessary step was the creation of the labour movement and the trade unions, and I do think that was a positive. I'm appalled that the trade union movement is now part of the ruling class, and they're backing them up. But the creation of the Labour Party was the biggest mistake the working class made, because it was an attempt to live with capitalism. So we are having to relearn those lessons, and we will do. We're finding ways.
Okay, thank you.
I think, is it Robert Tressel who wrote The Ragged Trousers Philanthropists? I think he would be very proud of what the Labour movement achieved. I think he would consider today a significant improvement. I think 47%, I don't wish to make, I am a Remainer, but 47% of the population, well, not percent, 40% of the voters was for Remain. I think some of that included the working class, so I think you're wrong to exclude as though some working class people have been betrayed, not entirely. And also, I do think the traditional form of working class is dead. I mean, my dad grew up in a really poor part of Gateshead, that was an ex-mining town, and that was the traditional working class. My generation, there isn't the old traditional working class. No. There's not that identity. There is loads of people who are working class, but it's not a battle between a deep elite and all these working people who are in mirror images all over the country. It's just spread out across a huge, diverse workforce who do not feel unified and feel like very different people.
Yeah, okay, thanks for Steve.
3 contributions that I can sort of deal with once.
Yeah.
The woman at the centre here talked about the necessity of democratic politics as the basis of how we go forward as opposed to just class. And the chap there said that although numerically the working class is still the biggest, social class, if you like, will it be the working class that sort of takes us forward? And the chap here said that he was always regarded himself as middle class. And I think you're all absolutely right. When we talk about the working class, I should preface it by saying the majority of society. I don't care what you regard yourself as. I don't care what job you do, what your salary is. I really have no interest at all. What I'm bothered about is what defines you. What defines you politically? If you regard yourself as a good democratic citizen, and we can all join together in a universally fought for and agreed set of policies to get us out of this mess that we are in this country, I don't care what label we stick to it. Working class, middle class, universalist, democratic socialist, I don't care. The point is we have to fight for a new political content that we have never had, if the truth be known. But we're certainly in a position now to really start and forge a new one. I've genuinely never been this excited in my whole life.
Brian.
The lady there was quite right. What's happened in the last 40 years, we have to look at that, and I think that's what's weakened class bonds. And what's happened in the last 40 years is globalisation has happened, and we can't divorce the two. Globalisation and the regional engine of globalisation in this part of the world is the European Union. And the European Union wants to abolish the nation state. And you can't divorce class from nation. That's what defines the working class, is the nation they're in. Because you can't have democracy outside of a nation state. It can't happen. It can only happen where people agree to a set of rules and vote. And there's the whole... Voting was invented by the trade union movement. Without the Chartists and without the suffragettes later, there would be no democracy in this country. It wasn't the Tories that invented democracy. It was the working class. Sorry?
Or the EU.
No, well, the EU was obviously I'll get back to the point of the European Union.
Stop.
The European Union was created by Europe's largest corporations to dominate and remove the power of the nation state. And that's what it's about. And the working class people, all they've got in terms of agency is the nation state. All they've got is the vote. If you take the vote away from them when it's meaningless, then they have nothing. And so that the point is that the class and nation are the same thing. Now, Emily Thornberry famously tweeted, "Look at that Nazi with the flag of St George," right? And she was called out for it. She thinks anyone who's got a flag of St George is a Nazi, right? Now, if you go to football or you go to the rugby, and working class people, they don't even understand what she's talking about. They see themselves as English or Scottish or British or whatever. And so that's how they see themselves. They haven't got a problem with that. But urban elites that believe in corporate power, that believe in the powers of the European Union being transferred from the nation state to undemocratic corporate institutions like the European Central Bank and the European Commission, clearly don't like the working class because they're getting in the way. And one of the things what the EU does, briefly, my last point, Ella, what the European Union does, it encourages politicians to try and get away from their electorates. Because they don't want the problem of that. If they get absorbed into the structure of the European Union, then they haven't got a problem with that. Working class people understand that. That's why they hate it. Now, maybe some working class people voted for Remain, but the point remains is that it's about the abolition of the nation state, of what the European Union wants to do, and the working class understand that.
So we can have the discussions around class, but ultimately we'll narrow down into how do we make change politically. And when you're at the intersection of race, ethnicity and class, coming from that immigrant experience, the migrant experience, where Labour would have been your natural home, where you're grown up and you're taught, you need to do this, you need to learn this, you need to eat this, because if you don't, the Tories will get their way and throw you out. So you grow up with this, and the Labour Party was the natural voting bloc. But where you've got this generation and the second generation, a third one coming behind that, which have moved on through, professions and earning potential, where is then the natural home? Because the Labour Party isn't, but the Tory Party is always seen as institutionally racist. Where do you go as people of colour from working class backgrounds?
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, I'm a bit confused as to how you kind of can argue that Brexit is like a victory for the working class when it was, the whole argument through the referendum was kind of proposed by people like Boris Johnson and Michael Gove, who want to create a capitalist state out of that, and it doesn't benefit the working class in any way.
Which, I mean, that's something I want to come back to is strange bedfellows.
I think the most interesting thing about class today is not necessarily its existence, but rather how people identify with it. I think anyone who works for their hands are working class, that's how I would define it. But when I was up in Leeds, I noticed that there's a real sense of solidarity between the sort of people who are working class. They don't vote Conservative and they identify as sort of working people. Whereas where I'm from, a lot of people who, whether they're plumbers or builders, they don't identify as working class. They want to be above that, and they sort of vote Tory, not because they're rich, but they just... So it's really peculiar. Some people sort of embrace that sort of identity, whereas others want to be distant from it. And then when you compare that as well with sort of, during my time at university, you get a lot of middle-class people who actually sort of appropriate middle-class culture, sort of wearing Stone Island or wearing Dickies trousers. So you've got this really peculiar sense in which working-class people are trying to identify as not working class, and middle-class people who, whose parents earn really good money are actually trying to identify as working class.
It's the donkey jacket phenomenon.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's really difficult to work that one out.
Okay.
The referendum was a victory for Brexit, for the Leave vote. The fact that various people kind of, were on the side of the Leave vote, whether that's Boris Johnson or not, it's kind of neither here nor there. The TUC and the Labour Party were on the side of Remain, and it's quite clearly not the case that the TUC were representing the vast majority of working class people, in what they were saying at that time. But there's a real difference between working class people, trade unionists, the Labour movement, and the Labour Party. All of these things, are very, very different. The most last year, the most kind of militant activity by trade unionists, or maybe not the most militant, but the most long-standing activity, last year in terms of strike action was by university lecturers and academic-related staff taking 14 days of strike action over their pensions. And at the same time, that group of people taking all that action were also saying, we should have a second referendum. So, by a substantial majority, about 90%. So all these things, kind of need a little bit unpacking, because it's not, you can't just say Labour movement, Labour Party, trade unions are all exactly the same. There's differences between all of them.
So there's been a lot of talk about sort of where is the working class? Well, there's this murmuring in the background, but they haven't taken centre stage. Where are the political organisations? And there's also, on the other hand, the other side of that, people saying, the working class is dead, because as a political force, they're not that identifiable. You know, in the trade unions, as much as like the RMT is a good example, it's 100,000 members compared to like the hollow shells of like Unison, for instance, which is like, what's the point in Unison, to be honest? Like, you know, it's a million members, but you know, not involved or active or, you know, on strike or doing anything like that. But looking around, like 30 years from now to the miners' strike, what was the difference between Peterloo and the new union movement at the end of the 1800s? You know, if that's a big gap of there being a working class but not being a working class on the political stage. And I think there's a tendency for people to think, oh, how are we going to, you know, us cadre of, you know, thinking working class political people are going to create us wizards are going to create this magic spell that will summon the working class demon and it'll, show its power again. I don't think that didn't happen with the new union movement. It's just something that happened overnight almost and changed things forever. And I think, you know, could happen again, but I don't think we're going to, you know, just by wishing it, we're going to make it happen.
As we know, there's a distinction that's often made between rising above your class and rising with your class. And I'm just wondering if you think that's still a useful distinction to be made. I mean, the typical discussion seems to be that we ought to be rising with the working class people ought to be rising with their class as a whole being elevated, and that people who just seek to rise or escape from a working class background are in a certain sense class traitors, or they are, there's a kind of conservative impulse to that because it leaves the rest of the class architecture as it is. And I'm just wondering how helpful you think that distinction is and whether you think it still tracks any useful political reality today.
Hello, I'm Swedish, and in Sweden the interest of the working class seems to have shifted a bit lately. I don't know how to put this, but the working class have sort of been replaced at the bottom of the food chain by a class of people who are so far from the jobs market that they will probably never ever get a job. And most of them are immigrants, which means they are perceived as a completely different group. So the working class find themselves paying into a system, a lot of their money, while the system's payouts don't go to themselves anymore. And this seems to have changed their priorities. I'm wondering, is there a similar thing happening in Britain?
I think it's been clearly established, especially by this woman's question over here. I'm not sure where she is, but there's a strong correlation between the strength of the working class and the strength of the Labour Party, and I think this is a process which has resulted in, to put it mildly, the current condition of the Labour Party we have now. And this is a process which I think was referred to as softening up, which occurred during the 70s and 80s. Now, I just wanted to ask the panel, what is your explanation? What are the root causes of this kind of demise of a strong representative party of the proletariat?
Yes, Kerry Dingle from the charity Worldwrite and Citizen TV Worldwrite, filming this weekend. Thank you very much for this session, Ella. And I do think Steve's stories are worth, because he went to prison during the strike, are well worth listening to understand the extent to which things have changed. You see, I don't think class now can take us forward at all. I do think we have to challenge all forms of anti-working class prejudice and ageism, just as we have to challenge all forms of inequality and prejudice. But I don't think it helps. And I think while we can be incredibly positive about the Brexit vote and a belief in our capacity to challenge and to change things, particularly not just around ideas of the nation state, but in our belief that the power rests with us, not the behind closed door politics of the EU or of the Conservative Party or of this dreadful Parliament, and sadly even the Brexit Party and others going down that road of making it about the machine rather than what we're capable of. That was the old class politics, and that's something worth retaining. But it won't take a class form, and what we should understand when we talk about a younger generation, and I know Fraser back here talked about the Extinction Rebellion and, you know, people taking matters into their own hands, which is a good thing. But in reality, we live in profoundly anti-human times, where when human beings are seen as a toxic scourge on the planet and the environment is more important than people and abundance and their development and their freedom, my God, we've got a bigger fight on. And unless we put forward a pro-human view, then we can forget ever grabbing power. And Brexit is just a microcosm of that, because it's about us equally having a say, and that's why democracy has to be a bottom line.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to come first to you, Steve. The last thoughts of reflecting on anything that you've heard.
I'll be really quick, because I've said an awful lot. To the young chap that talked about how on earth the working class going to benefit from Brexit and standing with, you know, old Etonians and blah, 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 blah. Well, I'm afraid we had that argument in 2016. And I think what you're not grasping is that what happened in 2016 is that the working class, for the first time in generations, entered the political stage and just frightened the ruling class to its absolute roots. And that's the potential that's in there, to fight for democracy. Because if we have democracy, what we've got is a citizenship across classes in this country that can really rock the ruling class and upset the status quo. And within that is the potential for all classes to benefit. And I have to say, what all that you just sound like a narrow, shallow, anti-Tory person. And it's that sort of leftist, Labour, shallow anti-Toryism that's been the downfall of the working class for many generations.
Okay, thank you, Steve. Brian, any closing comments?
Yeah, just to say that the European Union is a Tory project. The Tories took us in, the Tories campaigned to stay in, the Maastricht Treaty, all the treaties are a Tory project. The David Cameron's referendum is a Tory project. But what happened is they campaigned for it and people didn't want it. So what's happened is a section of the Tory party has decided to represent those interests. The most devastating thing is that the Labour Party have become those pro-EU Tories. And that's what's led to the demise of the Labour Party, because they're now a part of the old establishment, represented by Michael Heseltine and Ken Clarke. So they've just absorbed themselves into an elite that doesn't like the people. And the people will remain. The people will always be here, and the working class will always be here.
Can we please thank our speakers?